Hello, everyone. Um, this is Emma Donoghue, and today I'm here to talk about my new novel, The Pull of the Stars. It's got two very beautiful covers. In Britain and Canada, it features these gorgeous birds on a night sky, and in America, it features a nurse's watch. You're my guinea pigs today because I've been doing a lot of virtual events. Like most authors at the moment, I'm discovering how to do virtual book touring. So I've been doing lots of events about The Pull of the Stars, and I thought for this one, it might be fun to do something a bit different. So I apologize in advance for any technical errors. I don't have a technical team standing by, so I'm doing my best. So what I want to share with you today is a sort of slideshow of photographs that help to inspire The Pull of the Stars. The novel is set over 3 days in a pandemic, not this one. 1918, the terrible flu that was known as the Spanish flu sometimes, even though it seems to have originated in Kansas. And also it was also known as the black flu, the khaki flu, the blue flu, the great flu, the war sickness sometimes. So it's been described as the first pandemic that was really captured in photography. And so this is one of those books in which I've drawn on really evocative images. And I want to share some of them with you. I should have started by saying thank you so much to the bookshops who are banding together to set up these wonderful at home with events. And thanks for letting me do what I liked with the format. So the photos I'm going to share with you today, they were found by my dear old friend Margaret Lonergan, who also did the illustrations in photographic form for my last novel, Akin. And these photographs, Margaret did the picture research, cleaned them up because some of them are very 1910s, and determined their provenance as well. So really grateful to Margaret for that. And now let's see, can I manage this? Here we go. Oh, by the way, I'm going to talk for about probably half an hour about these photos, and then I will very happily accept any questions that come into the chat function. So we're starting with a picture from Dublin, my hometown. Now, I could have set this novel anywhere because all I knew was that I wanted it to be set during the flu pandemic and that I wanted it to feature a maternity ward, because one little known fact about the terrible flu of 1918, it didn't just hit adults in their 20s and 30s as the target group, but women in late pregnancy or during or just after birth were disproportionately slammed by this hideous virus. And the medicines at the time were just so basic that they were really blundering around in the dark. So anyway, I decided to set this novel in my home city of Dublin, not just to get the voice absolutely right of Julia Power, the nurse who is the protagonist, but also because Ireland was going through such interesting changes in those years. So here we have a picture of a tram in Dublin. This is a little bit earlier than my book. It's around 1900. And notice that there is electricity, there are wires overhead, but there are still horses and carriages as well. This photo is from the National Library of Ireland. And here's a much more well-known part of Dublin. It's a postcard of College Green. That big building on the right is what had been Ireland's Parliament in the 18th century. But then when the Act of Union happened, the rich MPs all withdrew from Dublin, and it kind of fell into rack and ruin, really. Again, this picture is from the National Library of Ireland, and this shows College Green around 1918. 1918, of course, you'll immediately realize World War I was on. And although they never did conscription in Ireland, Ireland was very much the British Empire at the time, and a lot of Irish men volunteered. So here we see some war recruitment posters from 1914 trying to give a specially Irish spin on it. So here you have a sort of Irish-looking gentleman with his green jacket and bow tie, and a kind of slightly country-looking boots, following the classic English Tommy off to war, showing the real Irish spirit, and a bundle of shamrocks on the ground. And I think real Irish spirit was clearly meant to make the whole thing look like a whiskey ad. And then on the right, you have a classic, wild-haired, shawl-wearing Irish woman gesturing over at Belgium and saying to her man, "Will you go or must I?" Many people in Ireland, of course, were not in favour of the war at all. Now, this is a particular group of Irish soldiers, the 16th Irish Division. This photo is from the Imperial War Museum. And I think what you see from this photo is just the out of this world, post-apocalyptic looking wasteland of the Western Front, a landscape that it's really hard to imagine surviving in. This photograph, which is from the US Army, I'm not sure quite why they were taking pictures of an Irish regiment. But this was a regiment called the Fighting 69th in a dugout near Luneville in France. And the sheer claustrophobia of this image, the way he looks as if he's going down into hell. In a way, in my novel, which is set entirely in a maternity ward in a Dublin hospital, I was trying to capture a sort of equivalent world for women as serving in the war might have been for men. Um, a feeling of claustrophobia and stress and inescapable demanding work, but also the kind of amazing solidarity and comradeship and camaraderie that could go with it. As you see, the man on the right has had extreme facial damage. And in my novel, there's a character who is nicknamed Noseless Nichols. He's a hospital orderly. He's one of a number of orderlies working at this Dublin hospital who have all had, they've all come back from the front where they were stretcher bearers. And on the right, you see he looks remarkably different. And this would be an example of some prosthetic face masks made for wounded soldiers by an American sculptor called Anna Coleman Ladd. And this photo is from the Library of Congress's American Red Cross collection. So this sculptor turned her powers to making kind of realistic face parts for men, often in metal and enamel. So this was one of the photos that would have made me think, oh, why don't I put a character into my novel whose wartime damage is literally readable on his face, and raise the question of sort of how much you can bear and how much you can carry on with. So of course, not all the Irish supported the war. Here you see a large group of the Citizen Army, a Republican group at Liberty Hall in the middle of Dublin in 1916. And they've hung up a banner that says, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland," meaning, you know, not the British, not the Germans. So there was this extreme tension in Ireland at the time between those fiercely opposed to the Germans and signing up to fight for the king, and those, you know, perfectly friendly to the Germans and just wanting Irish independence from Britain. And the funny thing is, I tried to keep this kind of material out of my novel at first. I was really wanting to focus on women's lives and the lives of these women, either sick with the flu during their pregnancies or the nurses and doctors trying to help them. I was trying to keep the question of what, you know, in Ireland we traditionally called the national question out of the novel, to keep it at bay. But I found it crept in because, of course, things like who dies in a pandemic, as we've come to realize in 2020, these are very political questions. They are, the answer to that question is almost always based on our social arrangements rather than purely genetic matters. It's based on factors like poverty, bad air, healthcare, all those pre-existing conditions of poverty. And that was true in 1918 as much as now. So yes, I found that the question of sort of Irish politics necessarily crept into a novel that was meant to be all about healthcare. Here we have Dublin Central Street. It's now called O'Connell Street. Then it was called Sackville Street. And you notice in the background behind those two stylish women, a gaping hole. That was from the six-day Easter Rising in 1916. This picture is from Trinity College Dublin, which is very near that area. Here's a close-up on that gaping hole. Right beside, in the background, you see the building with all the windows smashed in. That's our General Post Office. And this picture is from the National Library of Ireland and the National Archives. Now, one thing I decided early on in writing The Pull of the Stars was that I would set the novel in an inner city hospital. So its patients would be not the rich women of the suburbs where the middle class had kind of fled to as Dublin crumbled, but very much most of them would be the women of the inner city. And not only did families often live really cheek by jowl, many of them to a room, but the birth rate was really high. Ireland has had a very sort of pro-natalist culture, you'd have to say. And you know, the sheer number of children being raised in families that could barely feed them was appalling. So these three photographs here, they're all from 1913, and they're all from the Royal Society of Antiquaries and the National Archives. And I'd just like you to remember when you're looking at these photos that a baby born into inner city Dublin had less of a chance of surviving its first year than a soldier in those trenches on the Western Front. That first photo was from Chancery Lane, by the way. This photograph is from a part of inner city Dublin called the Coombe, And at first glance, it looks like a crime scene, doesn't it? I find it interesting the family are not cheerfully posing here the way in the previous picture lots of kids and adults were out on the street. This is such a shameful setting. The family aren't in it at all because you see the holes in the wall, the creeping damp, the crumbling, the stained fireplace, the ash everywhere. You know, standards are really, really low. The next photo is from a street called Francis Street. And here, the figure that haunts me is that little child in the background. I'm not quite sure, was that girl meant to be in the photo? You know, she has not been cleaned up. She's wearing a stained little pinny. She looks distinctly nervous and wary. I think there's another child in the bed there, possibly sleeping or possibly sick if it's the middle of the day. And the bed is all buckety, as we'd call it. And the bit I find heartbreaking is those pictures on the wall, the kind of, you know, aspirations to gentility of having framed prints on the wall. So this is the context for the patients in my novel, The Poem of the Stars. Julia Power, the nurse who's much more middle class, you know, she's just enraged that so many of her patients turn up already weakened by, say, the multiple births they've had before. She's got one patient who's come in with one leg permanently swollen up from the last time she gave birth. So I find this a very striking image. It's Dublin slum dwellers in 1901. Three women who were the type known as shawlies, working class women with their shawls fiercely wrapped around them. And I notice, you know, some of the kids holding kids as well. I think in huge families like that, there's a lot of kids minding kids. I'm the youngest of 8 myself, so I know that my big sisters in particular did a huge amount of looking after me. And I was curious about this photo, you know, was it taken by, you know, in a way, was this photo taken by somebody middle class trying to kind of, you know, gawk at the horrors of the poor? So I looked it up and I found it was taken by a woman called Mrs. Charles O'Connor for a magazine called The Lady of the House. But actually, the article it was published alongside was quite a progressive piece called The Last of an Historic Dublin Slum, written by a journalist who was always, you know, arguing for how unfair it was to make people live in such poverty. So I think actually this was the nearest thing to a kind of an activist photograph of its day, like the way we might retweet a photo of a victim of police violence today. And this photo makes me think about what we're doing when we write a novel about other people's suffering, because I'm really aware, I was aware of this with my novel Room as well, that it's not good enough to simply sort of point to a horrifying story and making the reader kind of a shiver of, oh, I'm glad I'm not living in a locked room. Or I'm glad I'm not giving birth to my 12th child in Dublin in 1918. You know, that there has to be a political point to it as well. You have a duty to get it right and to characterize the victims, like we see in the photo, as real people with real agency who make real decisions, and not just make your readers sort of shiver with voyeuristic horror and relief that they're not the ones suffering. You know, you need to make sure that you're creating this work of art for the right reasons, and that you're not just kind of making entertainment out of suffering. So hospitals before the pandemic, and here's a 1914 hospital from, in fact, a hospital in Brisbane. This photo is from the State Library of Queensland. And in a way, I'm including this picture to show a kind of a baseline of how hospitals were. They were pretty low tech by our standards, but very organized, very neat, lots of nurses per patient, an aura of calm, and they were run in a very hierarchical and orderly way. I found when I was researching nurse training of the time, there was a huge emphasis on propriety, punctuality, neatness, arrangement of the hair. You know, it was not all about the medical information. There was a lot about basically being a lady and keeping an air of ladylike reserve. Nurses were not meant to tell their first names to patients, for instance. But in my novel, Julia Power she suddenly finds herself running this small maternity ward herself because her superiors are off sick. So suddenly she's finding that she's bending the rules, because in a situation of such crisis, it seems to her really hard-hearted not to answer a patient who asks her name. So little by little, she starts to bend the rules. And so, you know, setting a novel at a moment of such crisis kind of allowed me to show a very stiff and hierarchical system, but also to show how once things start to get rather looser in the pandemic, Julia has a chance to really sort of shine and make her own decisions more. Here's a photo from 1904 called Doctor and Nurse, and I think it's great showing the kind of official relations between these professions. And this is a photo of Dr. Basil Hood in Charing Cross Hospital in London, and of course an unnamed nurse. I noticed the patient can hardly open his eyes, and Dr. Hood is very much, the strong silent hero, and the nurse is looking over at him very deferentially as if he might give orders even while they're taking the photo. So this image is from the Wellcome collection. Nurses did so many tasks themselves. They did a lot of things that would nowadays be done by other people in the hospital. And they made up medicines themselves when they were authorized to by the doctors. They cooked up some of the food, for instance. You were meant to, cook up beef tea or eggs or an egg flip, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, they had so little authority. So it's a job I've written about twice now in my novel, The Wonder, as well as in this one. And I think it's because it's a wonderful halfway point. These women were trained and had a lot of skill and very high standards, but they were in no sense running the show, and they had to be terribly deferential to the doctors. So this is an image of Cork Street Fever Hospital in Dublin in 1903, and the picture is from Cork Street Archive at the Royal College of Physicians. Now, birth was mostly not a medical matter. Most women gave birth at home, but if there was a crisis, you might go to hospital. And one thing I found interesting about researching obstetrics in the 1910s is that you always tried to save the mother because the death rate of babies was high anyway. And it was so difficult to do anything for, say, a preemie. I mean, literally, they had this warm box, this incubator. That's about all they had to offer. This photo is from a London hospital in 1908 in Lambeth. And so they pretty much just kept them warm, and they'd say, well, we'll just wait and see, does it survive? So the emphasis was always on saving the mother so that she just might be able to have more babies. The emphasis was always on women, especially Irish women, as baby making machines. So then comes the Great Flu of 1918. The death rate was extremely high. It may have killed 3 to 6% of the human race. It was not by any means worst in Ireland. It seems to have been worst in many countries in Asia and Africa. Here we see the San Francisco Casket Company, and they were delivering coffins at top speed. And the photographer for this photo was Christopher Helen. They had a lot of posters spreading public information health campaigns, and some of them rhymed. Just coughs and sneezes, spread diseases. So I decided in my book I would have a series of government health information posters, and I would try and capture, the weird mixture of false reassurance. There'd be statements like, the government has the situation well in hand, while the coffins were mounting up. But also quite a bit of victim blaming, quite a bit of emphasis on, how the victim was failing to make healthy choices. It would say something like, do not go into damp places. And I'm thinking, if you're a Dublin family living in that rotting room we saw in the earlier photo, how are you meant to avoid damp places? How are you meant to choose fresh air and sunshine if you were living in a hovel in the middle of Dublin? This photo is an example of how, pandemics often trigger xenophobia. So the figure in the background going, how do you cachu? He is Senor Spanish influenza. So this cartoon is strongly implying that it's an outside foreign thing. This is just like when Trump called COVID the Wuhan virus. So this cartoon is from an LA paper actually, and it's complaining about health measures. Basically, it's complaining about shutting meetings, shutting cinemas, shutting schools, and it's basically blaming it all on the dastardly villain with the very strange moustache. This photo is from the LA Times archives, and the previous poster about coughs and sneezes was from the US Public Health Service. I like this one because it's so specific to the time. They were warning against spitting in a way that you don't hear much of now. They were also quite preoccupied with kissing, a lot of advice about how to kiss safely, maybe through a handkerchief. Nowadays, there's very little said about kisses. So this particular picture is by an artist called Hanlon, and it's from Temple University Libraries. Here's one cartoon specific to Ireland. It's from the Sunday Independent in early 1919, when the third wave of the flu was hitting. There's the very strangely insect-like flu arriving in the door saying, you remember me, I was here twice before. And the public health authorities looking rather confused and bewildered, and the common people, desperately trying to shelter behind them. I included this picture as an example of how someone will always try to make a buck. Just as people are, selling masks, selling face shields, selling, some dodgy supplements like zinc. Um, they were trying to sell Horlicks malted milk on the back of the influenza in 1918. Um, Again, the emphasis on, you preserving your own health by eating or drinking the right thing. Government posters often advised you to eat an onion every day, for instance. So there was very little emphasis on the real social conditions like terrible housing that the individual could do nothing about. It was all about, you making decisions and, you warding off the illness yourself. They would even say things like, defeatism lets in disease, as if you're catching the flu by weak-mindedness, So here is a flu ward. As I said, the so-called Spanish flu, it is now thought to have begun among soldiers in Kansas. So here is a flu ward at Camp Funston in Kansas. This picture is from the Otis Historical Archives of the National Museum of Health and Medicine. And you see how, nurses and doctors are having to work under very difficult ad hoc conditions with very little space around. Those low cots must have been awful to constantly bend over. Very basic conditions. This photograph is interesting. It's from Washington, D.C., the Walter Reed Hospital. And I notice it's kind of semi-outdoor. So I'm wondering if the hospital overspilled and had to sort of improvise using a veranda, or if they thought fresh air was perhaps a key factor, so they should set up the flu wards there, because there was, I know later on they used a lot of sanatoria for TB sufferers. So I'm wondering if, the fresh air was all part of the cure here. And this picture is from Haring and Ewis photographers and the Library of Congress. And I love the way the man is peering up at the nurse as if to say, like, do something about how I feel. My head is throbbing. This one is a much more disheveled looking flu ward in Oakland. This photo doesn't look posed as most of them are. There are no partitions between the beds, not even curtains. Nurses are crouching, adjusting their masks. Some of them are carrying bundles of laundry and having a quick consult with each other. And some of these could be volunteer nurses, because this is a photo of the American Red Cross in Oakland Auditorium. This picture is from the Joseph Noland collection at Oakland History Room at the Oakland Public Library. This poster made its way directly into my novel because I was so struck by that slogan, a masterpiece of guilt tripping. These women were unpaid. They had only been trained, once the war broke out. It was an absolutely new volunteer job. And yet you're told, if I fail, he dies. And it's interesting that it's he. I don't think men got the flu any more than women did, but the idea is that the gallant soldier, the male soldier, has risked so much for you. And this is a recruitment poster for the Red Cross by Arthur G. McCoy. It's a color lithograph, and it's from the Library of Congress. I think an image like this reminds you that women were already branded as the caregivers and the mothers and the self-sacrificing healers long before the war and long before the flu. So no pressure, but if I fail, he dies. This picture shows nurses and kitchen staff, and I'm guessing that that's a kitchen worker on the left without a mask. So you see, I think the masks in that particular hospital, which is Kentucky, as a hospital in Kentucky, I think what it suggests is that the masks were only being used for those who directly were looking after patients, and there wasn't a feeling of everyone in the hospital using masks to keep each other safe. This is a set of instructions for nurses from New Zealand, actually. It's a list of advice for dealing with patients with the flu. And it reminds you sort of how many different tasks nurses were meant to do. Like your serious cases there, you were meant to give a hot sponge bath twice a day. You were meant to prop them up in different ways at the head of the bed or at the foot of the bed. You were meant to yourself gargle 3 times a day with a mixture of salt and borax to try and keep yourself safe. Pieces of rag to be used for sputum and then burnt. As you see, there was a shortage of supplies there. Here we go. Here are some nurses in London loading blankets at Gower Mews in 1918. Again, this is from the Wellcome collection. And I included this photo to show that the lines between jobs were blurred. I don't think nurses in modern hospitals would have to go down to the truck and literally get the pillows and blankets out themselves. Also, many supplies ran out. So in my novel, for instance, they're not using cotton swabs that could not be had for love nor money. They're using swabs made of flax tow. Tow? I can't be sure, to be honest. And the photo is taken from September 1918, when what I find really poignant is that they probably didn't think that the they probably didn't think the flu was going to be around for. They probably thought it was over because they'd had it in the spring. It had been bad enough. But what they couldn't have known was that in October and November, the second of the three waves would come, and it would be far, far worse. So I drew not only on photos of nurses themselves, but sort of paramedical jobs. For instance, I love this picture of the St. Louis Red Cross Motor Corps in Missouri. This picture is from the Library of Congress. And notice that so many women, not just in healthcare, but in the countries during the war anyway, they stepped temporarily into jobs that used to be men's jobs. And these ones are wearing skirts barely below the knee. They're really taking up a kind of a physical, responsible role that was not open to women before the war, and in many cases wasn't open to them after either. And here's another picture of these very sort of strong and upright and sober looking characters. And this one is from Washington, D.C., again from the Library of Congress. You can't draw a neat line around, say, nursing or even paramedic and say that's medical care and nothing else is. So here's a photograph that shows that blurred line between nursing and welfare work. It's a picture of Red Cross nurses in North Carolina bringing food to a family whose mother has just died. And the image is from the National Archives. And I noticed, for instance, that the masks are only on the nurses, and the family just looks so utterly defeated, like the food's come too late, that this health outreach only reached them so late as to be pointless. So masking was a big thing in 1918, but it wasn't universal at all. It caught on in America much more than in Europe. And here you have one picture from Locust Avenue, California, showing wear a mask or go to jail. So the battle got particularly fierce in California, where you had some anti-mask societies. This particular picture is from Raymond Coyne, Lucretia Little History Room, Mill Valley Public Library. Often masks were worn in a way that we would now consider pretty useless, and they were often worn in the streets, and people would take them off as soon as they got into a building. But these clerks in New York are wearing them during the job. We're all aware of the image of the female bus conductor, say, in World War I, and women in transport were the most visible, but there were also women in a lot of behind the scenes, very physical jobs like boiling sugar in refineries or hauling coal in barrows. But in some ways, the really big change was women in clerical and secretarial and bureaucratic jobs. This was really the beginning of women entering the kind of office workplace in a huge way. This picture is from the Everett collection. I have no idea who these are. They're just called Workers Having a Break, 30th of November 1918. All we know is they're masked. The clothes look vaguely military. They look like women to me. But I think this is an example of how evocative photographs can be to me, because often they're too blurry for you to know how to read the details. The details have been lost, and yet they look out at you and you're like, that's a real person staring me in the face. One of the films I found really inspiring for The Pull of the Stars was Peter Jackson's documentary about World War I, in which he took old footage and he cleaned it up and colorized it. And that first moment in the film, I think it's called They Shall Not Grow Old. And there's a first moment in the film when a black and white image, he suddenly colorizes it, and it's as if the dead young man in it has just sort of come to life and stepped out and looked directly at us. And I found it utterly haunting. So health precautions were done in the wider population too. This shows women making masks. It's from California State Library. And I like their kind of, don't bother us, we're busy kind of look. This photo made it directly into the novel as well. It's actually a couple posing in the streets of London, but they're just so stylish, and their masks are so weirdly beak-like. I just thought this is such a haunting image, and it reminded me of that first moment when I was hooked by the idea for this novel. It was when I was reading an article in The Economist magazine, and I thought, okay, that flu pandemic sounds like a post-apocalyptic one. It doesn't sound historical. It sounds modern and urban and weird. So I decided to have, when Julia Power's on her way to work on the tram in Dublin, I wanted her to look out the window and glimpse this couple walking stylishly by with their weird beaks. And this picture is from the Alamy photo agency. Just as now, people often improvised about masks. This, although it looks to me very like two male comedians in drag, it's actually a picture of sisters from the National Museum of Australia. They used other methods than masking. These soldiers, for instance, they've been told to gargle with salt water to prevent influenza. I don't think it would particularly help, but I suppose it might help against bacterial infections. And these soldiers are in Camp Dix, New Jersey, again in September 1918, before the second wave was really about to hit. And this picture is from the Everett Historical Collection hosted on Shutterstock. And this picture also reminds me that I've heard that on public transport, they, like trains, they would have a communal water cup. And no one thought to get rid of those when the flu broke out, because the idea was, well, it's got water in it. It must be constantly washed out by the water, mustn't it? So this is another Dublin image from a little street called Brady's Cottages off Lime Street. And I just want you to notice the air, the sense of bad air, lack of ventilation, a narrow little street, all these houses backing onto each other with all the children in there, smoke from coal fires, maybe factories nearby, the damp of Dublin, how hard it would be to keep anything clean, Say you've got somebody sick and you're cleaning out their, bandages and, sheets covered in bodily fluids, and you have to scrub them somehow with your bad water supplies and hang them up out in the communal lane. There'd be just no way to follow the government's advice all about fresh air and sunshine. I'm just going to talk about one particular victim of the 1918 flu in Dublin. I'm going to have her sort of stand in for all the others. This young woman didn't even make it to hospital. She was a blacksmith's daughter called Catherine Moran, born in the Liberties area of Dublin. And this is a picture of her from the 1900s. Fred Heatley, her grandson, passed on this picture. So she married a trunk maker, and their first baby was born 12 days after the wedding. And then another one 2 years later, another one after. So they were clearly all set to be one of those huge Irish families. But like many working class Irishmen, her husband Charles Heatley signed up and went off to war. And this was immediately an economic boost, right? The wages were clearly better than they'd had before, because now Catherine and the three little boys were able to move from their one-room flat in High Street to a new two-bedroom flat in the Ivy Trust buildings in Bride Street. He became a Lance Corporal in the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, but then by 2 years on, 1916, she wasn't hearing from him anymore. And she put a little ad in the paper saying, had anyone heard of him? Was he run away? Where was he gone to? And then finally in 1917, she gets a telegram from the British Army to say he was believed to have died at the Battle of the Somme the previous year. On the first day of that battle, there was a man killed every 4.4 seconds. So Catherine herself caught the flu in November 1918, and she moved back to her father's house and died there. Her cause of death was said to be influenza pneumonia certified, which I think would mean that a doctor came out to certify it. And she's buried in Dublin's Glasnevin Cemetery, where in fact most of my relatives lie too. Interestingly, the British Army offered to take the three orphan boys, who were now 8, 6 and 5, and said that they would rear them in the Army orphanage/college in the Phoenix Park in Dublin, but both families said, no, thank you very much, we will raise them ourselves. Which brings me to the issue of Irish residential institutions. Ireland had a lot of its population in these institutions, and they were funded by governments both before and after independence, and they were run by various orders of the Irish Catholic Church. I really wanted to include this in my novel because these institutions were such a factor in the lives of the poor. So we'll start with mother and baby homes, which are currently the subject of a massive Irish government inquiry, and the report isn't in yet. You weren't legally imprisoned in these, but you would be told by the nuns that you had to stay a certain amount of time and work there in order to pay back the costs of your time there giving birth. And they would sort of double this sentence if it was your second child, as a kind of a double punishment, because you were now what they called a repeat offender. You were most unlikely to be allowed to take your baby home unless it was your first baby and unless you had a very supportive family. So this particular picture here is from Bethany House, which was founded in Dublin in 1921. I notice, they're doing their best with low staffing numbers. They have the babies tied into little chairs. And I notice there's an older girl over to the far left who I assume would have been helping with these tiny ones. This particular one where you have so many babies in cots or in the kind of playpen in the middle, this one is from a rather notorious institution, the Sean Ross Abbey in Roscrea. This was the setting of the book, The Lost Child of Philomena Lee, and the film Philomena, which has become notorious for this huge, big communal grave known as the Angel's Plot, where we don't know how many mothers and babies are in there, but nobody's suggesting some kind of deliberate murder scheme. It's more that these institutions were run in a way that led to the deaths of a lot of babies, and the bitter argument nowadays is about how that compared with the death rates of the time anyway. So notice in this photo there are nuns and there are lay staff as well, and one thing I found when I was researching The Pull of the Stars was that in these tales of abuse, often the survivors would describe the lay staff doing very cruel things to them, because the nuns would run the place but then be quite hands-off and leave the hands-on stuff to the lay staff, who were minimally trained and left with huge crowds of children to look after. So I think what you see in these situations, it's not so much was any individual person a monster or were the nuns monsters, it's more that these institutions were a bad situation in which society's most vulnerable, like these tiny children, just had no protection from the whims of the adults around them. This one is the Bon Secours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam in County Galway, which operated between 1925 and 1961. And again, that place has become notorious for a huge communal grave. There's a character in The Pull of the Stars, Bridie Sweeney, who is an unpaid assistant volunteer who helps Julia out. And I decided it would be really interesting to have Bridie coming from a situation where she's been raised with no reason to be grateful to anyone, and yet, far from being embittered, she has a natural fount of sort of cheer and vitality, and she wants to feel useful for the first time in her life. So she's from what she calls the pipe, from orphanages. Another part of the pipe was the Magdalen laundries. This particular picture distresses me because these look like children, but these were young women who would have been sent to the Magdalen laundries either for getting pregnant, or rather getting impregnated by man, or being in danger of getting pregnant. They'd be seen as vulnerable to sex, and so they'd be sent off sort of for their own safety. That was the theory, and then they would be used for this extremely profitable work of doing laundry. And these places often had big machines, and the women sent to the Magdalen laundries were often stayed a long, long time. It was a grey area. Often there was no authority for the nuns to keep you there, but you wouldn't necessarily know that. And this one here is Our Lady of Charity on Sean McDermott Street in Dublin. Again, I find these young women just unbearably poignant. So I wanted to give Julia and her new friend Bridie a couple of moments of a break in the novel. So they fangirl over a Mary Pickford film. This is Mary Pickford from the Exhibitor's Herald in 1920. The third key character, and my last set of photos today, are of Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who's the only real person in my novel. So this is a picture of Cumann na mBan, a women's organization in 1916. It's from Kilmainham Jail Museum. And Kathleen Lynn was, I didn't mean to include her in the book. I was just looking around to see what interesting doctors were around at the time. And I found this doctor who specialized in ophthalmology and midwifery and insanity, all because she didn't get any one hospital job, because the male doctors were pretty resistant to having her as their colleague. So she did a lot of different hospital work. She set up her own flu clinic for the poor in 1918. And she was meanwhile on the run from police because she'd been involved in that 1916 Easter Rising, and she was on the executive of Sinn Féin. So she was an important politician, a suffragette, an activist for the poor. She had plans to found her own children's hospital. So she was just revolutionary in so many ways. There she is. There's Kathleen Lynn in the 1930s. At the moment my novel is set in early November 1918, she did get arrested, but the Lord Mayor of Dublin got her let out to work against the flu on the promise that she would stay out of politics, which of course she didn't. She couldn't ever do. One interesting thing about Kathleen Lynn is that she was not just personally nourished by her long partnership with her comrade Madeleine French Mullen, but Madeleine, here they are together. Madeleine, the one on the right, seems to have funded Kathleen's flu clinic and then funded the children's hospital that they set up the following year. And they spent their whole lives together ever since they met while working for the welfare of Belgian refugees at the start of the war. And they were not the only female couple in the Irish Revolutionary movement. There were quite a few of them. Here's another picture of them in which Madeleine on the left is looking far more kind of butch and rakish. She may just have been shutting one eye, but it looks quite a rakish grin to me. In most of the group photographs, they carefully pose themselves with at least one of their comrades between them, but I like this one in which they're side by side. And this is the hospital for children specifically. In fact, it was aimed at those children who had infectious diseases who no other hospital would take, and in particular, lots of young children who had congenital syphilis. So they started this hospital. You see it's described in Irish as Teach Niamh Ultan. So speaking Irish would have been very much part of the revolutionary movement. And they founded it with just 2 beds, but it went on to be a really important hospital, and it had some wonderful eccentricities like beds on the roof. I'm assuming there must have been a flat roof because I'm only seeing a peaked roof there. And they kept goats for fresh milk for the children as well. It was an old shooting hall before Kathleen Lynn took it over and made a children's hospital of it. And here's a picture of St. Ultan's with lots of doctors and nurses holding children. She prioritized hiring women very non-denominationally. I mean, she had lots of her, nationalist revolutionary pals in there, but she would hire Protestants or Catholics. She didn't mind about the politics, but she did prioritize hiring women doctors. So this picture is from 1919, and I love the kind of messy, friendly atmosphere, And another thing Kathleen did was that when she took a child into the hospital, she would offer the mother a holiday in the country while the child was being looked after. And she and Madeleine French Mullen, who was the administrator of the hospital, they went on to found a vaccination project, and they vaccinated thousands of poor children against TB, which led to Ireland's own BCG program, which has vaccinated all babies since the 1950s. This shouldn't need saying, but vaccines save lives. And Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine French Mullen lived together until Madeleine died in 1944, and Kathleen lived on until 1955. I'm going to finish with this image of Kathleen holding, I think, 4 scrawny looking babies, who I hope fattened up a bit after that. So that is my slideshow. And yeah, I think you can tell from the photos, the sort of range of things that are included in the Pull Up the Stars. Even though it's got a very tight focus of, just 3 days, just a tiny little 3-bed maternity ward. In a way, if you pay close attention to the lives of the people working in that ward, so, the doctor coming through who's on the run from police because of her revolutionary commitments, the assistant volunteer who's been sent in from the nuns because she's really a product of the kind of orphanage system, and this is the first time she's ever been able to feel useful and valuable, and then Nurse Julia herself. So you've got the people working there, but then also the patients coming in and out, and their different outcomes. I think you see that even a novel with a potentially really kind of narrow frame actually brings in all sorts of things. So I'm just going to move over so I can see a bit of chat now. As you can tell, my screen sharing is not particularly sophisticated. Oh, wow. Hello, Anfield from the Wirral. I'm trying to remember where the Wirral is. I've heard of it. One thing I'm loving about these events is that if you do a live event somewhere, no, I don't mean live, I mean face-to-face. What's the opposite of virtual? Actual? Anyway, when you do a live event, it's lovely. It's like a party. It's very face-to-face. And if you're an extrovert like me, it's a great contrast with the sort of quiet, being at home on your own writing sort of business. So it really nourishes you, and meeting people who are so enthusiastic about books or even who might respond strongly. They might stand up and say, why did you end your last novel like that? But either way, they care. So it's enormously energizing. And, I miss those events and I want to do them again. However, having had virtual book touring forced on me by COVID this year, I have to say there are certain advantages to it. I can reach more of you. I can reach you all over the world. I can connect with people. Even in any one session, I can connect with people from different continents. And also these events have a kind of a lingering half-life online in that people can access them afterwards. So, logistically, they are an amazing way to connect with a lot of you, even if they're not quite as much face-to-face fun for me. Um, Looking for any interesting questions. We've got people in here from Bradford-on-Avon. Hi, Catherine Loden. Malcolm McMaster in New Jersey. Sue Manley from Ormskirk in Lancashire. Yes, Stephanie Downey says, so interesting yet depressing to hear how history is repeating itself in the way we respond to a pandemic. That is so true, isn't it? I'm often asked how I feel a similarity or contrast between 1918 and now. And I would say there's no comparison. It was worse back then because science knew so much less. For instance, doctors like Kathleen Lynn, they would be doing autopsies, peering through the microscope at material taken from, the lungs of their patients. And they were trying to spot a bacterium and identify it. And they were so frustrated they couldn't find a bacterium. And that's because it was a virus, which is much smaller. And they didn't know what viruses were. And they didn't have microscopes that would have shown them anyway. So they literally didn't know their enemy. Whereas we all got familiar with that spiky crowned image of the coronavirus within weeks. Again, information took much longer to travel. And the war really thwarted the precise flow of information because all the governments of the countries involved in the war didn't want to even admit that the virus was a factor in their country, and because that might depress morale. So, they called it Spanish, just because, the king of Spain admitted to having it. So I would say we know so much more now, and yet it's so frustrating that this doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to act any more rationally. Another big difference is that our COVID is hitting the old so hard, whereas the 1918 pandemic was known for hitting young adults. So, they're not identical, but the same factors of, social conditions being part of what leave people vulnerable to a virus long before the actual virus touches their bodies, that seems to be as true as ever. Liz Hardwood says, horrendous, how can it be a girl's fault? Yes, I'm sort of assuming you're talking about some of those institutions like the Magdalen hospitals. You're absolutely right. It is incongruous, isn't it? That if, for instance, a girl seemed to be on the verge of getting sexually abused by an uncle, what they would do is send the girl off to the Magdalen hospital. Astonishing sort of victim blaming. And, on the theory of protection, this kind of paternalistic mindset led to some women being effectively locked up for life because many of them did not manage to kind of grow up, age out of the system and leave. You'd need to be quite assertive to leave, or you'd need to feel you had somewhere to go to. So when these Magdalen hospitals were, eventually the last of them were closed down in the 1980s, there were women in there really completely institutionalized who had been effectively used as a kind of, laundry slaves. And there was no easy answer for what to do. So I know Ireland has gone through such a painful period of reckoning about Magdalen hospitals, and then one source that I read for the Pull of the Stars was the really long Ryan report of a government inquiry into abuse in residential institutions. And, with every novel I write, there's one thing that is really painful to research. So in the case of my novel Room, say, there was I read a website about so-called feral children, raised in isolation. And I wish I could wipe that file from my mind. And in the case of the Pull of the Stars, it is this long report called the Ryan report, because it's funny, it's not even the more, salacious stories of crazed nuns whipping you or cooks plunging your hand into boiling soup. It's the tiny little details. A girl being blamed for having red hair because that's the devil's color. As a dyed redhead myself, I identify very strongly with the redheads of the world. So the idea that you would be rebuked for having red hair, or that many of the survivors of these institutions remembered being told that they were useless, that they should be grateful for whatever they got because they were really just parasites on society. Let's see. Oh, Liz Harwood makes another good point. With a virtual event, we all get a long time with you, she says, not just a brief 30 seconds. And you may be saying the same thing 100 times, like the Queen. That is true. Yeah, so there you're describing the lineup to get your book signed. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people treasure that moment, but as you say, there's the pressure of the queue behind you, and the author is usually repeating herself quite a bit by then. Hi, Mary Suller in Rochester, Minnesota, USA. Wow, you guys are coming from all over. Um, so one big decision I made about this book early on was to set it in a maternity ward, and this is partly because I came across that fact about, um, women late pregnancy. They tended to catch the flu more easily, and they tended to have more elaborate side effects, and that effect lasted till several weeks after birth. So it seems to be an immune system over response, and I thought that was really interesting because it gives each of those women sort of two different stories medically. It complicates the situation because somebody's flu might be nice and mild, and then suddenly they're in labor and it's all going horribly wrong. Or equally, someone can have a desperate case of the flu, but the labor goes well. So it's kind of two intersecting plots, and both of them quite unpredictable. And of course, birth is kind of a writer's gift subject because it's not an illness. It's not an inherently bad thing, not at all. It's a wonderful thing, but it can go so wrong, and it can go wrong at any point. Um, I gave birth to both our kids and loved the experience, but say after our first kid was born, I had one little thing go wrong, and I realized I got great medical care and all was well within 15 minutes. And I put that scene straight into the novel, by the way, as a kind of a thank you to the doctor and nurse and midwives who got me through. But I remember thinking, if I was in rural Uganda now, I could be dead. That birth is all very marvelous as long as we support it enough and we give women enough care. And at first with COVID, I thought, oh, well, at least it's not particularly hitting pregnant women. But actually, quite recently, the CDC in America have said it does seem to be hitting them harder than women who aren't pregnant. So again, this pandemic seems to be taking its toll, particularly on women in that highly delicate state of having a baby, which gives me the shudders. But anyway, I would say that by choosing to set the novel in a maternity ward, in a way, I got to really center women in the story. And I put in a scene where Julia is arguing with an orderly called Groin. He's a bit of a sexist, so I thought I'd give him a truly hideous surname. And Groin is saying, women's vote has just come in for women over 30. And he's saying, you lot don't deserve the vote, right? Because you don't pay the blood tax. You don't serve your country. You're not called up to go to war. So you don't earn the right to be citizens. And Julia's pointing around her and saying, look around, women pay the blood tax every day. The nation starts here. So I suppose I was really trying, by setting the novel in a birthing ward, I was really trying not just to kind of celebrate the drama and sometimes heroism of birth, but also to suggest that it was a sort of equivalent for women of war, in that in every generation it's the thing that might kill them. So it was really interesting and enjoyable to kind of focus a novel on birth, which is not often done. And it is funny that some of the reviews, instead of saying like, oh, the scenes of people dying of the flu are horrendous, they're like, oh no, the childbirth scenes, I had to read through my fingers. So I think perhaps we are particularly squeamish about that stuff. It's funny. I'm just looking for any other interesting questions. It's so nice to hear from such a range of you all over the place. Now, I should have said from the start that I wrote this book in 1980. It only feels like I'm that old. I wrote this book in 2018, finished it in 2019, sold the book, and then I was doing extensive rewrites. I finally deliver my last draft early March this year. And then 2 days later, the WHO announced that COVID was a pandemic. And really only then did I think, oh, so there's a bit of a similarity between my story and now. I had no idea of that while I was writing it. And the novel was only meant to come out next year. So I thought, well, people will be sick of pandemic stories by the time the novel comes out. But then my publisher said, it's more relevant now. Let's bring it out now. But it does feel distinctly odd to be going around promoting the book as a novelist and people asking me all these questions about, like, how has society changed in the last 100 years, which are really above my pay grade. I'm no authority just because I very intensely researched and wrote a novel set in 1918. But on the other hand, I am thrilled to have an opportunity to kind of point out the astonishing brilliance of healthcare workers, the whole spectrum of them, who, find more in themselves than they thought they had, and who are running risks not only to their own health. I mean, so many of them have caught COVID, so many of them have died of it, and they're risking bringing it to their families as well. So it's an extraordinary range of careers, which I would not be able for at all, and I loved having the chance to write about them. I was very privileged that I got to consult with a midwife when I was doing the final copy edits on this novel. So she was in quarantine in April, and she gave me the benefit of her advice on the book. And I also had the same copy editor for this novel that I had on The Wonder, which again is about a nurse. And that copy editor is an emergency room doctor half the time and a copy editor half the time, with equally rigorous standards for both. And it was such a relief to have her, catching some of my medical bloopers. Because the funny thing is, if you know a subject is really specialist and difficult, you'll hyper research it. So some of the medical procedures in the book, I did loads of research, but then other things were more basic or seemed more basic. So I thought I had them down, So at the last minute, my copy editor caught some deep confusion of mine about blood pressure, those two figures, because I didn't think that bit was hard enough that I needed to really research it. Oh, good question from Alice May. Having now lived through a pandemic, was there anything you wish you knew when writing the novel? Or do you think it was easier with a blank slate? I think it would have been very hard to write the novel now. Like, even if I'd say sort of planned it, if I was still at the writing stage, I think I might be almost paralyzed by those similarities between then and now. I'd be wondering, was I ascribing to my 1918 protagonist the thoughts and the issues of today? I'd be afraid that the whole thing would just be read as a kind of a veiled version of 1918. It's funny, you need a little bit of distance from the present day if you're used to writing, say, historical novels, and if you're somebody like Ali Smith, who writes novels that would, say, include Brexit as soon as Brexit happens, that's fine. She's clearly used to that. But I'm used to being a bit more arm's length about the issues of the day. So for me, it would have been paralyzing. So I'm really glad I got it finished early. Let me see, any more interesting questions? No, I think I should wind it up so as not to go over. But here's the book, The Pull of the Stars. And I very much enjoyed talking to all of you. And thank you very much for listening in. Thanks again to the bookshops who have collaborated on the At Home With series. It's just amazing how sort of spontaneously and cooperatively independent bookshops have pulled together events in this weird year. And please support your local independent bookshop. Any business that you want to be still there after this pandemic, you need to be supporting now. I've been ordering a lot of cakes from my local bakery, for instance, in a form of economic patriotism. So do the same about these wonderful bookshops, and quite a few of them have signed copies. I think there are about 3,000 floating out there. I see Book a Bookshop have signed copies there already. So thank you all very, very much, and stay safe.